左右，因为24年呢也不一定就完全准了，可能有点误差，大概是1万多年。然后呢，从秘鲁的考古学来看呢，秘鲁目前这个史前文化最早呢可以找到公元前14000年，那么这个时候开始有这个旧石器时代的遗址。当然了，从14000年到这个公元前2000年这个阶段呢，是叫前陶时期，就是没有陶器的时代，前陶器时期。所以说在公元前4000年到3000年这个阶段开始出现农业种植，这个是很大的进步啊。我们都知道，这个秘鲁盛产什么？盛产玉米、土豆，是吧？这样的这种现在来说是很重要的一种粮食作物。多伦多已经上线了啊，没事儿，我把这个说完啊。这是前陶时代啊，是公元前14000年到公元前2000年。接下来它这个发展阶段呢叫形成期，这个形成期呢就是公元前2000年到公元前200年这么一个时间段。出现了陶器制作和纺织，然后开始有金属的冶炼和农业的灌溉，这个时候很重要的。所以说我们今天这个杜教授要讲的就是茶文文化。就是这个阶段的，就是距今公元前800年到公元前200年这个阶段，出现了这个大型的这种宗教祭祀仪式嘛，就是神庙一类的东西，这个都是用石头垒砌的建筑啊，非常这个壮观，然后也出土了各种的艺术品，种类非常丰富。那么这个阶段呢，按照这个美洲考古的分期呢，也叫第一水平层时期，就是在这个茶文文化阶段呢，在秘鲁的东北部地区啊，形成了一个广泛的文化面貌相同的这么样的一个时期，所以它叫第一水平层，就是文化面貌基本接近一致。之后呢，它进入到叫发展期，我是根据这个秘鲁这个国家考古和历史博物馆上面的它这个发展序列啊，当然秘鲁这个发展序列大家认识不完全统一，我是参照这个博物馆的发展序列来给大家介绍一下。发展期呢，就是公元前200年，到公元700年，这个阶段呢，就不是文化统一了，又开始文化各地有地方特色啊，形成一个这样的一种各种类型的文化这种各自发展的这样的一个局面。然后到了公元700年到1200年，公元700年到公元1200年，这个阶段呢出现了一个叫瓦底帝国的，这个时期呢又出现了在秘鲁的中部、北部海岸地区又出现了一个范围比较广大的一个具有帝国性质的这样的一个国家啊，叫瓦里帝国。之后呢，从公元1200年到1470年，这个相对精确一点啊，又是到叫地方政权时期了，它又开始分裂成若干个小的这种地方政权，一直到公元1470年，印加帝国对整个的安第斯山脉的这个就是南美安第斯山脉的中部地区，包括北部地区的包括一些热带雨林地区，这种大范围的统一。所以说这个用英语呢管这个印加帝国叫塔万廷苏尤，就什么意思呢？就是苏尤是区域的意思，塔万廷呢就是就是分成4个大的区域啊，叫四方之地啊。所以说这是说明这个印加帝国的范围非常的广大。这是从文化序列上，大家要有一个这样的概率的认知，然后大家能知道茶文文化处于它第一个这个水平层时期，就是一个非常重要的一个文化发展阶段，奠定了秘鲁这个后来的这种文化发展。另外我们也知道，这个秘鲁的自然地理特点呢，也大家清楚吧？它的西部呢是临海地洋，虽然临海，但是因为它受这个寒流的影响，所以说并没有充沛的降雨。这个雨水都是从哪儿来的？都是从这个东面来的，就是安第斯山脉，东部地区，包括安第斯山脉那个山顶上也有大量的降雨。只有这个西部沿海地带反而是这个沙漠，这种热带沙漠气候。那么这种热带沙漠气候呢，就导致人类很难利用，要想利用它，必须有灌溉。所以说，就是有了灌溉技术之后，也是从茶文文化开始呢，这里开始进行这个人类的开始进行这种殖民和开垦。另外还有一个特点就是，因为这个安第斯山脉这个上升的非常快啊，就是沿海这个平原呢，也就是几公里宽啊，甚至也就是1-2公里宽，就上升到山脉地段。所以说，一些部落呢会在 它寄居在这个沿海平，就是这个沿海的平原，同时呢，它也在半山腰，还在山顶啊，它会有多个这种文化和这个农作物的地带，它们都在这里进行耕种，那么就会导致什么呢？它不同的季节要耕种不同的作物，也就是说，就像我们云贵高原上，一山有四季，什么十里不同天，就这种场景啊，在这里会出现。好，实际上这个我们知道秘鲁还有几个很有名的地方啊，马丘比丘这个是，我们去了之后也不知道这个干什么，导游说这是印加帝国的农业研究院啊，那地方都是试种各种作物的，因为现在也说不清是什么。还有一个很有名的叫纳斯卡巨画，这大家也都听过，也是很有名的，这个画的在地面看不出来，因为特别巨大，只有到空中之后才能看到这个星星。从整体上来讲呢，这是秘鲁这个文化、地理自然环境，包括文化特色跟我们差别比较大。它的国土面积呢，大概是128万平方公里，人口是3000多万。呃，现在呢是，秘鲁呢，这个整体而言是一个，我觉得我个人认为是比较开放的国家，尤其是做考古工作呢，世界各地的考古学家都在那边做啊。所以说我们人大也想在秘鲁做考古。2019年的时候，我们组队去秘鲁天主教大学进行了一个访问，认识了这个杜兰多教授，跟他也建立了合作关系。本来计划是2020年的时候呢，我们那时候派老师去讲中国考古，在天主教大学，然后天主教大学派老师到我们这讲秘鲁考古，但是因为疫情呢就耽误了。但是好在我们有国际小学期，这国际小学期这个课程呢，我们请这个杜兰多教授过来，给我们连续开了好几年，效果是非常好。因为大家知道这国际小学课程教书现在卡的也越来越紧啊，把关把的越来越紧。那么安第斯古代文明这课呢，一直都是在这个国际小学授课范围之内的啊，也说明这个课讲的也好，而且这个非常重要。那么接下来呢，我就介绍一下这个多兰多教授。多兰多教授呢是现在任职于这个秘鲁的天主教大学，这是一个私立大学，管理的非常好，这个学校也是很有名，在秘鲁也很有名。他的本科呢就是在秘鲁天主教大学毕业的，就是获得本科学位，然后之后呢就去美国读了硕士和博士。他的这个就学单位呢是美国伊利诺伊大学，厄巴纳香槟分校考古学系，在那里获得了硕士博士学位。然后，2004年的时候，他就回国，在秘鲁天主教大学任教，从这个助理教授到副教授再到教授，现在是秘鲁天主教大学考古系的系主任。它的主要研究内容呢，就是当然也包括这个考古学和这个海洋社区的民族史、民族史和民族志，还有社会考古学以及定量和计量方法在考古学数据中的应用。指导过一些比较重要的这个考古项目啊，主要是他在秘鲁，他的工作重点就是在秘鲁东南部的沿海建立这个考古文化序列的问题。那么我们就请我浪费了几分钟时间啊，我们请这个多兰多教授做讲座。老杜。
Yes, the main screen, right?
Yes, Professor.
Excellent. Okay. Well, this was really interesting. Anyway, hello everybody. It is a real pleasure for me to be here. I am very happy to see my colleague and friend Professor Liu. Hi, how are you? Hope you're doing just fine. I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank Renmin University for this invitation to talk about my research. The title of the lecture today is Understanding the Roots of Andean Civilization, a new look at the Chedin phenomenon. My name, of course, I think I was already introduced, is Jal Dulanto. I am a professor at the Catholic University in Lima, Peru. And I am the chair of the archaeology program in this university. I have been teaching in the International Summer School at Renmin University already for 3 years, and it has been a wonderful experience for me, I have to say. Very, very interesting experience for me. So, without further introduction, I'm going to begin my lecture. And let me begin with a few words about Andean civilization and about civilizations in general. The Central Andes, what today is Peru, is one of 6 undisputed cradles of civilization in the world. Scholars usually agree about 6 of these cradles of civilization. And by cradles of civilizations, we mean, of course, areas of the world that saw the pristine, primary, or independent emergence of complex societies. And by complex societies, we mean basically societies that show economic, political, military, and ideological, quote unquote, state level of organizational complexity. These 6 areas are, as many of you, I'm sure, know, located in what today are the modern countries of Egypt, Iraq, Pakistan, China, Mexico, and Peru. We're talking about the Egyptians, the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley in Pakistan, of course, the Chinese civilization, American civilization in what today is Mexico, and of course, the Andean civilization in what today is Peru. Now, for a long, long time, we have known that each of these areas shows important particularities. The civilizations that emerged in each of them were the result of processes that lasted several millennia. Yet in each of them, these long processes and the civilizations resulting from them are in many different ways unique. Take, for example, the Inca Empire. The Incas entered world history relatively late when they were conquered by another empire, by the Spanish Empire. The picture on the screen shows you the capture of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa Yupanqui by the Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizarro on November 15, 1532. This is, of course, almost 500 years ago. Before that date, the Andean world, and I want you to remember this, was basically unknown to the rest of the world. Indeed, up to that moment, Central Andean people had existed in almost total isolation from all other civilizations of antiquity for thousands of years. And to the surprise of the Westerners that conquered this part of the world, they were civilized. In fact, the Spanish were quite impressed with them, and we have very good records of this. Besides providing them with unbelievable amounts of gold and silver that made some of them very rich, by the way, the Inca Empire showed an equivocal science of complexity, political and economic. Tawantinsuyu, the land of the 4 quarters joined together, as it was known by the Inca, was the largest empire of the world at that moment, 1532. It was larger than the Ottoman Empire, and it was also larger than the Ming Dynasty. This is an empire that was the largest native state ever to arise in the Western Hemisphere, right? It was the largest empire of antiquity ever to develop south of the equator. And even more, it is the only one extending north to south along one of the most rugged mountain chains in the world, only second to the Himalayan mountains, right? This is an empire that spread across several latitudinal zones, not along latitudinal zones. And this poses, as you may know, huge challenges to any kind of state or empire. At its high, its capital, Cusco, that you can see in the image to the right, rule over parts of the modern countries of Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. A huge empire indeed. Now, just as a point of comparison, so you get an idea of how huge this empire was. The Tawantinsuyo was 4,000 kilometers long in a straight line, right? And this is actually 5,500 kilometers long if you walk from one extreme of the empire to the other. This is longer than the distance separating Beijing in China, where you are right now, to Islamabad in Pakistan. A long distance, by all means. And especially if you take into account that in the Andes, they didn't have any draft animals, no cars pulled by horses or camels, and of course, no rivers that you can navigate. So this is even more amazing when we take into account the lack of advanced means of transportation. Now, all this is even more impressive when we take into account Andean geography. The Central Andes, which cover most of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, is a land of environmental extremes. It has snow peaks reaching heights of up to 7,000 meters above the sea level. The Andean mountain chain that runs north to south actually divides the whole area in three distinct ecoregions, from west to east. And in, by the way, a relatively short distance, we find a coastal desert, the Andean mountains, and the Amazon tropical forest. Since the beginning of Andean history, these environmental extremes demanded different adaptive strategies and foster distinct evolutionary pathways, right? So not only a large empire, but an empire that actually spread across latitudinal zones, right? But actually that had to incorporate into its organization very different people adapted to many different environments, people with different cultures and people with many different languages. A real organizational challenge. Now, impressive as they were, the Inca were neither the first nor the only one complex society that developed in the Andes. For almost 400 years, scholars actually thought that they were the first and the only ones. Today, we know they were preceded by several complex polities that originated, developed, and collapsed in the Central Andes for almost 4,000 years. The table on the screen shows you a summary, if you want, of the main periods, cultures, sites, and developments of Andean prehistory. Humans arrived at the Central Andes sometime around 12,000 BCE, and I myself have conducted some research in some of the earliest settlements of the Americas. These were complex hunter-gatherers with broad spectrum adaptations. During the early Preceramic, the period that is highlighted right now in the table, they adapted and became specialized to the most diverse coastal, mountain, and forest environments they encounter as they move into the Central Andes and colonize different territories. Now, this is a period, of course, of several thousand years. And what I'm conveying to you is actually quite a simplification of a very long and complex process. During the following period, the Middle Preceramic, what we call the Middle Preceramic, Indian people established sedentary villages and domesticated several plants and animals. During this time, we even have evidence of the first small scale irrigation systems and also evidence of communal gardens, as well as evidence of small public ceremonial places. But these small centers of the Middle Preceramic lack any substantial architecture. They are not impressive. Indeed, they are very difficult to find for archaeologists. And the more sites we investigate of this period, we actually find no significant evidence of social complexity in any of these archaeological sites and the societies that left these archaeological sites behind. Now, it is in the next two periods, known as the late Preceramic and the initial period, that we find the first signs of emerging social complexity among Andean populations. These are very interesting periods to me. I have devoted several years to study these periods of Andean prehistory. But a warning is in order here. For most of this period, the only evidence, and I have to emphasize this, the only evidence of complexity that we find is in the form of public ceremonial centers with monumental architecture. And don't get me wrong with this. These are really large buildings if we compare them with what we find at similar stages of civilization in other parts of the world. Indeed, these buildings are going to be the largest of the New World for thousands of years, right? Perhaps one of the most famous of these early public ceremonial centers with monumental architecture is Caral, Caral. It is located on the coast of Peru, some 200 kilometers north of the capital of Lima. On the screen, you can see aerial photograph of one of the main buildings in this ceremonial center, this early ceremonial center. The site was occupied for almost 1,000 years, and it covers an area of 66 hectares. And today it looks like this, what you can see in the two pictures to the right. Now, it didn't always look like this, of course. It was occupied for 1,000 years. The buildings that you see in these two images were built progressively, right? Not at the same time. It is how it looks today, but it didn't look like this until the very end of its history. For 1,000 years, it looked very different from century to century. It contains at least 32 large public ceremonial buildings. The one I show you in the previous slide is just one of them. These buildings include large step pyramids with central stairways, sunken circle courts and plazas. And well, indeed, the site is impressive. It is the focus of tourism today, and it is a main referent for national identity since it was discovered a few decades ago, right? And in fact, the site is so impressive that it has been sold to the general public as a sacred city, as the capital of the earliest Andean regional state, as the quote unquote mother culture of Andean civilization, and also as the oldest civilization of the Americans and one of the oldest civilizations of the world. But guess what? Caral is in reality, is one out of several dozens of centers of similar antiquity and size. Indeed, we find these sites or sites like this all over the coastal and highlands of Peru. I said dozens, but they are easily more than 100, perhaps hundreds. We don't know all of them, but from the little research we have conducted in in some areas. We know there are many of them, right? Now, this, of course, takes us to ask a few questions. Are these sites really capital cities of regional states? And the answer is no, they are not cities. All the large buildings that we find in these sites are public ceremonial. The more we study them, we are more sure of their almost unique religious character. They are not administrative centers. They are basically designed to um, perform rituals, to organize rituals. These sites have very few residences, and the few of them that we find at these sites are relatively small and of the same size. So there is no evidence of differences in the size of these residences or houses. There are no workshops of any kind, no storage facilities. There are no cemeteries. And the few burials that we find at these sites once in a while, we know they don't show any differences in status. So we don't find any evidence, neither in houses nor in tombs, of social differentiation of the population. These sites, even more, were not occupied permanently, but they were built over several centuries, and they were visited only sometimes of the year. And they are not capitals. All the sites with large public ceremonial buildings that we know for this period are relatively large and of the same size, if occupation span is taken into account. What today we see as the larger sites are just the ones that were occupied for a longer time. The ones that we see that are significantly smaller, when we excavate them, we realize they were occupied for fewer centuries. They are not located in the center either of their territories. They are located in the margins of coastal valleys or highland valleys. And the populations building and using these centers seem to have lived in rather small villages scattered on the nearby valley bottom. If you take Neolithic settlements from China, they are several magnitudes of order larger than the few villages that we know for this period in the Andes. And what kind of buildings they have? This is actually also quite interesting. Their large public ceremonial architecture is designed clearly to attract and host people from their own regions. They are designed to promote large gatherings. And we hypothesize, we speculate, gatherings that serve to exchange goods, to exchange information, to exchange marriage partners, and very much the way it is. It has been done in tribal societies for a long time. Their platform mounds, sunken plazas, and other open spaces are clearly designed to promote a theatrical experience. These are settings for processions and other orchestrated movements. These are locales that are using to organize basically huge parties, if you want. The built spaces were open and highly visible. All of the activities, ritual performances, and exchanges were easily accessible to the whole collectivity that gathered in these places. So it doesn't matter which building we look at, it basically looks like a place where everybody is more or less equal to each other. These are a very special kind of societies, right? And what kind of societies are these? Well, as far as we know, they are mainly small local villages with a few hundred individuals. But societies that had ritualized economies, quote unquote ritualized economies. They have or emphasize institutions of reciprocity, fairness, prosociality, and ritually sanctioned redistribution, right? And they certainly have ranks, but they don't have institutionalized inequalities, right? They're involved in intense intergroup competitive feasting and ceremonialism. Okay, some of these groups win this competitive feasting and ceremonialism. Others lose. The winners are precisely those which attract more partners and have more labor force to continue building their centers and to organize other kinds of activities they need to carry out. As a result, over time, we are going to see a distinct pattern. We are going to find fewer centers, but larger centers, right? Beginning in 3000 BC, and as we move from century to century, we are going to see fewer centers, right, being built than those that are being abandoned. And we are going to find that these centers that survive are going to become larger and larger. And these are going to be the winners of these competitions. As much as we have actually looked for evidence of violence, we have not found any. This is a period with no big evidence of war, raiding. This is no evidence of coercion. So this is a very, I like to call it, quote unquote, positive kind of competition. These groups, these societies are competing with each other within their regions, basically to attract people, to attract members. They are quite inclusive societies. They're not worried that much about excluding other people. They need labor force, right, to do bigger and bigger projects. Population is increasing for sure, but clearly it has not reached the carrying capacity of the environment. People are not fighting each other for few resources available. Not. On the contrary, there are enough resources for everybody. In what they lack is actually people, not resources, not material resources or resources for survival. At this point, it is worth to remember what Stanish and Haley tells us about the importance of ritual. Ritual is everywhere in these societies. And for them, ritual is central to the successful creation of complex labor organizations that are actually, by the way, characteristic of early rank societies in different parts of the world. For them, in an environment in which a group and leaders seek to maintain cooperative labor without the use of coercion, ritually sanctioned participation and behavior in the production and consumption of resources become a powerful tool. Really interesting indeed, right? Now, all this is going to change during the next period, the early horizon, which is the main topic of this lecture, right? As I just mentioned, for 2,500 years, beginning in 3000 BCE, before current era, we're going to find ceremonial centers all over the Central Andes. And these centers are going to be competing with each other to attract and host people from their own regions. Don't get me wrong, this is a quite Balkanized time. You find small groups everywhere, and although they maintain certain contact with each other, right? I mean, during the late pre-ceramic and initial period, they remain quite distinct from people from other regions. Now, this long process is quite interesting. It is characterized by a slow but a steady growth of population. At the beginning, as I mentioned, and I am repeating this so you get the point, right? At the beginning, new centers are built everywhere, but later, as the ritualized competition between these centers progresses, more centers are abandoned, then centers are being built. Populations are progressively incorporated in the fewer but larger and more impressive centers that survive. By the beginning of the first millennium BCE, with the beginning of the early horizon, few centers survive in the Central Andes, and they are very different from the previous ones. One of those centers is Chavín de Huántar. Okay? Chavín de Huántar, the famous site of Chavín de Huántar. Okay? And this is Chavín de Huántar. It is situated at an elevation of 3,150 meters above the sea level. It is located at the confluence of the Huacheca and Mosna rivers. And it has very complex architecture and stone sculpture. And indeed, although at first sight it looks similar to all the previous temples from the initial period and the late pre-ceramic, it shows some very important differences with them. It shows some very important innovations. The whole arrangement of buildings at the site is clearly designed to obtain a ceremonial center for oracular or shamanistic consultations. And the whole site shows very good evidence of an emphasis in public gatherings of people that seem to be arriving to the site to consult the oracle that we know existed at the site. This was a pilgrimage center visited by people from very distant regions all across the Andes. So not just the site, its design and planning is different from everything that we have seen before during the previous two periods I have mentioned, right? It is well, it is something new, as I will show in the remaining of these lectures. I will show you how. The temple was constructed as temples before over many centuries, basically between 1200 and 500 BCE, before current era. It has a complex building sequence that expanded both horizontally and vertically. The two pictures to the right show this process. The picture on the top actually shows you the final appearance of the temple. The picture on the bottom actually shows you the different buildings that were added to this project over time. It was founded 1200 BCE, as I mentioned. It actually was completed by 800 BCE. This is in 4 centuries, and this is actually quite fast in comparison to ceremonial centers of the two previous periods. And then after 300 years after it was completed, it fell into decline and it was abandoned. Okay. Unique to this site are a number of internal galleries. None of the sites that I have or that we find in the Andes in the previous 2,000 years show galleries like this. In addition, the site actually has a vast, complex system of drains and vents with clear hydrological and acoustic properties that are actually integral to the extensive design and planning of the site. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that the galleries in the drains and the vents were being built as the main buildings were being constructed. This is, they didn't build or they didn't construct these buildings first and then excavate the galleries and the drains and the vents. They were, these vents and drains and galleries were actually built as the buildings were being constructed. Now, these architectural elements are quite interesting, and because they are clearly linked to the ceremonial functions surrounding the evolution of religious and political authority at the center. The evolution of religious and political authority that is behind the emergence of clear signs of social inequality during this period. Okay, if you pour water in these drains, or if you blow wind through these vents, the building actually sounds. It sounds like a lion. It roars, if you want. Okay, quite interesting, by the way. Work by Sylvia Kempel. Her name is on the bottom corner to the right. Have allowed us to identify at least 15 construction phases that can be grouped in different stages. On the picture to the right, you can see how Chavindewanter actually looked during stage 1, also known as separate mount stage, how it looked during stage 2, or the expansion stage, how it looked during stage 3, and how it looked during stage 4, right? Now, early constructions design emphasize high volume and small spaces. So we have galleries from the very beginning, right? But with time, it changed. Later construction actually emphasized volume and larger spaces, plazas. So we speculate the site actually was a sort of shamanistic or oracle kind of site since its beginning, but it was not successful until later, when it actually managed to be famous across the Andes and be visited by people all over the Andes. Therefore, it changed in ceremonial use of architecture from small select groups of initiates to larger congregations of people that were looking for esoteric knowledge, exotics, and other interesting things that were being used as sources of power in new kind of society or new kinds of societies around the Andes. Now, let me show you a little bit about this side so you get a sense of what is going on here that is different from buildings before, buildings like Caral that I just show you. Perhaps the most famous gallery in the site is the Lanzón Gallery. It's called the Lanzón Gallery because the main sculpture is called the Lanzón and is the one that you see here, right here in the screen, right? Let me get a laser pointer here. Okay. It is a stela for 4.5 meters tall, so it's quite big. It's carved in low relief, and it is integral to the building. It cannot be removed without dismantling the whole building. It depicts a fanged anthropomorphic feline in clear Chavin style. And I mean in clear Chavin style because it has claws and fangs, is dressed in a fine attire, and is wearing ear spools. Here, ear spools are a sign or a symbol of authority in the Andes to this day among indigenous populations, right? It is in a typical Chavin style because it combines attributes of different animals, humans, felines, even birds. It is located in a very small closed room that has the unusual form actually of an elongated cross. The room is so small that only one person can enter at a time. If you want to enter the site, you have to enter you alone. I mean, you cannot have people next to you. At the most, you can have people coming behind, right, and entering the building in a row, right? But not two people can actually access this place at the same time or arrive in front of the Lanzon at the same time. So it's in a hidden place, hidden from the public, and only approachable through a very narrow corridor. So indeed, is very, very different from what we see in the previous two periods, where everything is open, everything is visible, everybody has access to the ritual activities and that are being performed in those ceremonial places. Nothing like that here. Here, rituals seem to be mysterious, seem to be secret, seem to be basically hidden from the rest of the people. Something special and unique and private is going on within these buildings that for all that matters are actually alive, if you want. Remember, they roar, they make sounds, right? This is how the Lanzon Gallery looks. Quite a small room, as I mentioned, right? Now, in front of this gallery, in the outside, there is a sunken circle of plaza. This is how it looks today, right? And this space is actually quite interesting as well for many different reasons. It is located in front of the stage 1 and 2 main building where the Lanzon is located. But it itself belongs to the stage 3 and 4 of the construction. So it belongs to the fluorescence of Chavindehuantar as a pilgrimage center. This sunken circle plaza has descending stairways on one side and ascending stairways on the other that actually take you to the Lanzon Gallery. Originally, it looked like this. You can see it in the picture to the right top, right? It actually had a hole in one of the sides that was used to put offerings. Below this hole, there is a water canal that took the offerings, took them somewhere else, right? It was paved and it has a cross in the middle. To the sides, to the right and to the left, it has several sculptures like this with anthropomorphic figures that combine elements of felines, jaguars, eagles, and humans, right? This one in particular is quite interesting because it's holding San Pedro cactus, which is a hallucinogenic drug, right? And it's one of several ones that combined show a procession of people that enters through this descending stairway, goes to the right, and then ascends the opposing stairway and goes to the Lanzon Gallery, right? And on the left side, there was another procession like this. Now, under these anthropomorphic figures, we have another procession, a procession of jaguars depicted in profile, right? So we have a procession of anthropomorphic figures above and a procession of jaguars below in both sides. So they enter this sunken circle space, they split into halves, and then they are joined together before going to the Lanzon Gallery. And this pattern, this kind of procession is typical of Andean rituals. Andean societies are prominent for dual organization. And I don't know how much do you know about this. This is, let's see, basic social organization in an introductory course of kinship, right, anthropology. These South American societies, indigenous South American societies, many of them are organized in what anthropologists call halves or moieties, right? And here, in the sites of this period, we find plenty of evidence of dual organization. Now, this sunken circular plaza is actually on top of a platform, and under or inside this platform, there are a bunch of galleries. John Rick, here is his name, emeritus professor now at Stanford University, have been conducting excavations at this site for the last 20 years or more, right? And right now he is excavating in this platform, and he's finding more and more galleries. But the two most famous ones are the Offerings Gallery that was excavated by Luis Lumbreras, famous Peruvian archaeologist that just passed away a couple of days ago. It is located to the north of the sunken circular plaza, the Offerings Gallery, right here, right? And when it was excavated in the 1970s by Luis Lumbreras, what he found there actually impressed the whole community of Andean scholars, Andeanist scholars. It actually impresses us to this day. He found hundreds of pottery vessels and other exotic goods from different regions inside. And these are goods that came from all over the Andes, from the north, from the south, from the west, from the east, from actually regions that are ecologically very diverse, very different from each other, and that nonetheless seem to have been visiting this place and leaving the objects they brought with them and presented to the oracle as gifts, right? On the opposing side, right, in the south side, this plaza actually looks to the east. North is here, south is here. In the opposing side of the plaza, in the south side, he also excavated a gallery that is known as the Snails Gallery. Excavation was completed by John Rick decades later, right? Here he found 20 strombus trumpets, musical instruments, made of strombus shells. Strombus shells are from warm waters. They came from hundreds of kilometers, actually 1,000 kilometers to the north of Chavin de Huántar. And they are not from the highlands, they are, of course, from the coast. And they are actually decorated with iconography that we know very well comes from, not from Ecuador, but from the northern highlands and the northern eastern lowlands of Peru. So once again, we have a very good example of an offering that comes from a long distance and that is ritual in character. It is actually pieces of ritual paraphernalia. Now, allegedly, at the center of this plaza, right, uh, there was a sculpture. We don't know this for sure because this sculpture was not found, as archaeologists say, in situ, right? And is for my favorite one, by the way. It's the most complex piece of Chavin iconography that we know about. It's called the Teo obelisk, and it's the what we see to the right, what you see in the image to the right, right? It is a 2-point granite stela of 2.5 meters tall that is carved in low relief. And it depicts two caimans, caiman crocodilos, two crocodiles, South American crocodiles, one a male and the other female, in a, by the way, typical pattern of dual opposition of and complementarity that is characteristic of South American societies. Interestingly, the male caiman or crocodile has several crops with below the ground edible parts. It also has a strombus and a spondylus seashell. I will show you another picture in a moment. The female one has several crops from with above the ground edible parts, right? If we um, inspect these depictions closely, they are indeed fascinating. They are not easy to read, by the way, not easy to read at all, right? There are a sort of combination of multiple figures, right? So you find multiple characters being added together as in a puzzle to basically make up a larger figure, right? That looks pretty much alive. So here is the crocodile, right? It has the head of caiman, legs of a caiman, right? Front legs, um, posterior legs, right? A tail, um, backbone here, right? And some serpents coming out from the head. There's a jaguar next to it, right? A strombus shell and a jaguar here, and a spondylus shell over here, right? Quite interesting figure. This is typical Chavin style. The presence of a strombus and spondylus actually is quite interesting. And we find it in many different depictions of Chavin art at the site. For example, in this smaller stela, where you have what is interpreted as a Chavin priest, right, with ear spools, remember, symbols of authority, serpent veils, um, claws from eagles, right, different kind of animal, fangs from felines, serpents as hair, and so on. So they are always figures that combine attributes of different animals. In one hand, he has his spondylus shell from Ecuador, from warm waters in Ecuador, 1,000 kilometers to the north. And in the other one has a strombus shell. They are not in scale. The strombus shells are actually twice or 3 times the size of spondylus shells. Strombus shells are usually considered female, and spondylus shells are usually considered male. So once again, a female side identify with the left arm. A male side identified with the left arm. A male side identified with the right arm. This is typical dual organization that we find in so many indigenous societies in South America, right? Now, we also have the black and white portal. This belongs to the stage 4 of the main building when the site was expanded and remodeled to receive large groups of people. This portal located here, right? You can see it here, was reached via a massive black and white stairway. And the portal itself has a black right and a left white columns and lintels, right? The 2 columns actually support a lintel that also has intricate carvings, engravings, right? And this is how the columns actually look like, right? Black one and a white one. The black one actually depicts a sort of anthropomorphic harpy, eagle, or hawk, right? And it is male. The left one, the one that is white in color, actually depicts a very similar harpy eagle, but this one is female. It has a vagina dentata that you can clearly see here in the public area, right? So once again, dual organization, opposition, and complementarity of two halves. Now even differentiated by colors, right? Not just sex or gender, but colors. Now, all these depictions are quite interesting, right? Chavin sculptural art is a unique invention with no presence or descendants. We have nothing like this before the early horizon. And actually, although we have some similar art in other ceremonial centers like Chavin during the early horizon, none of the other ceremonial centers have art as complex as this, right? The art is basically representational, but with a particular style and convention. It uses modular width and bilateral symmetry, for example, in the juxtaposition of profile faces to be read as a third full face. So you have one face here, another face here. Together they form one single front face, right? A third full face. And the figures can actually be read upside down. You can read them this way, or you can read them this way, right? And they make sense. The effect, of course, is that they are clearly presented as mysterious representations that are difficult to read or can be read, even more important, can be read in many different ways, right? The effect, indeed, is perfect for shamanistic rituals, for oracular purposes, right? Chavin art idealizes natural phenomena, especially animals, transforming them into supernatural beings, giving them human and other animals' attributes. And in particular, Chavin art emphasizes three animals. There are other ones, but the three that are the main reference in Chavin art are these three: caimans, right? Caiman crocodiles, associated always with the lower world and with water, right? Jaguars, Panthera onca, that are associated with this world, with land, and harpy eagles, harpia, associated with air, with the upper world, with the sky. All of them are from eastern lowland places. All of them are eastern lowland neotropical species, right? And this is actually quite interesting because Julio Tello and Tello, Tello, the father of Peruvian archaeology, hypothesized when he discovered Chavin de Wanter that Chavin de Wanter actually originated in the Amazon. Donald Lathrop, another famous anthropologists who work on this period, right, about this period, also hypothesized that the Amazon actually played a very important role um, in early horizon social and political transformations in the Central Andes. Now, to emphasize this, let's take the words of former Professor Gary Urton. He says, underlying all fascination with Chilean art is the perception that a considerable degree of artistic skill is represented in the composition, design and execution of most works rendered in this style. While we are often simultaneously repelled and attracted by the absence of a clearly identifiable focal subject, the eye immediately encounters a profusion of complex interlocking forms with no easy discernible central image and with no clearly defined figure-ground relation among the various parts of the clusters of images. It is as though one is viewing a very complex, highly stylized jigsaw puzzle, but as to whether or not the pieces are all in the proper places, and if so, what the image in the puzzle is supposed to be about, one cannot say with certainty, right? Well, I will argue here this is a very powerful device for conveying secret knowledge, mysterious knowledge, esoteric knowledge, powerful knowledge, right? So it goes hand in hand with what we know about shamanistic religions. Take, for example, the picture to the right. It is not easy to realize what it is. You actually have to be a little bit familiar with Chavin art to realize it is a highly stylized harpy eagle, right? The tail, the legs, the wings, the body, the head. I choose, sorry, this picture just to show you how difficult it could be to read this art immediately, right? It takes time. Now, but Chavin Wonder was more than a ceremonial center, and this is actually quite interesting as well. All the other centers I have talked about from the two previous periods, right, are just ceremonial centers and little else. They only have temples. They only have public buildings for large gatherings that are visible to everybody. Chavin Wonder is nothing like that. Chavin Wonder, as I already mentioned, has different kinds of rituals going on in there, but it also has very different spaces, right? It's a differentiated settlement where not only one function is being performed. It has it had a large residential population at some point, up to 3,000 or 5,000 people. Now, of course, this is quite small in comparison to similar sites in China. These 5,000 people were living in a large settlement, once again, large for Andean standards, 30 or 50 hectares in area. Its inhabitants were agropastoralists and consumed a variety of local cultigens, as well as camelids, llamas, and vicuñas from the nearby high altitudes, highlands. It shows clear evidence, by the way, of socioeconomic inequality. Houses are of different sizes. And it also has worships where goods being used in the temple are being produced. So it's a quite different kind of settlement. Some scholars have actually characterized Chavin not just as a public ceremonial center, but as a proto-urban center, even an urban center, right? It clearly, by the way, stands out apart from its neighbors. Many other sites of this period are not as complex as Chavin de Wanter is. No highland site of this period shows the size, architectural complexity, dense residential population, and quantity of exotic goods that we find at Chavin de Wantar. So it's not only a ceremonial center, but as I mean, it's something different, right? Today, scholars agree that it fits the definitions of urban, a proto-urban center, at least in terms of population size and population heterogeneity, right? Now, but that's not the only evidence that we have that Chavin is a different kind of settlement. Chavin de Huántar is actually one of many initial period early horizon settlements in its own region. Now, we have conducted little research in many of these other settlements, smaller than Chavin de Huántar, at least smaller than Chavin de Huántar at the end of Chavin de Huántar. But we know that many of them were actually abandoned around 800, 750 BCE, precisely as Chavin de Huántar was growing. And this is typical of urban nucleation, right? Of the growing of urban centers that began to gather populations from their own regions, right? Other sites, however, were slowly incorporated into the sphere of long distance interaction associated with Chavin de Huántar. They were not abandoned, but they became linked to Chavin de Huántar, also something that we find in developing cities in different civilizations, pristine civilizations around the world. So clearly, conversion to the Chavin cult was more a matter of adoption than imposition. Some people actually decided for some reason to become part of the Chavin sphere of influence. Others actually rejected it. Others were indifferent. And this is actually also quite interesting because clearly, even during the early horizon, we don't find signs or major signs of violence or coercion or imposition over local populations. Now, the Chavin de Huántar is not alone. Its region is not alone in the Andes. It is actually linked to something that we call the Chavin phenomenon or the Chavin interaction sphere. During the early horizon, we find a period of important changes in interregional interaction. I have devoted the last decade of my life to study these interaction networks between the coast, the highlands, and the tropical forests, between the different ecoregions that we find in the Andes, and between the quite diverse populations that existed in the Andes at the time, right? What we find in the Chavin phenomenon is a political and ritual economy, clearly based in part on access to exotic goods from distant sources, right? And it is not a coincidence that it is during the early horizons that we see the spread of long distance llama caravans. Llamas were, for the most part, used as camels were used in the old world. They were used to carry loads of goods, right? And they were used for basically long distance exchange. Now, this is also a period where we see the appearance of intrusive Chavin iconography at many highland and coastal centers as goods were moving, right, from different regions across the Andes to different ceremonial centers, one of them Chavin de Huántar, right? Information was moving as well, and people were basically transferring novel ideas and knowledge and very special secret knowledge from one region to the next, right? Esoteric knowledge from one region to the next. In the picture to the right, you see very simple depiction of this in of this Chavin phenomenon. And you see three circles because I am trying to emphasize that the Chavin interactional sphere was not the only one. There were other interactional spheres around other ceremonial centers at the same time. Chavin de Huántar seemed to be just the most prominent among group of similar centers, the most prominent among similar independent and autonomous centers that were not dominated by Chavin, right? Now, in some of these sites, early horizon sites that we find all across the Andes, right? But not in all of them. We find local populations emulating Chavin material culture, right? Others actually were rejecting it, or others were adopting other material culture from other networks. But overall, this is clearly a period um, of long distance networks, of new socio-economic relationships, of new connections between elites from different regions. And it is a period with a more cosmopolitan sense of identity. Now, there is one thing about Andean civilization that distinguishes Andean civilization from other civilizations around the world. For most of its history, it actually shows a quite balkanized pattern, right? You see small groups different from each other, um, not interacting with each other. But there are some periods that we call horizons in which this balkanization um, it's uh, it's broken, if you want, when societies all across the Andes uh, become more interconnected than in other times. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what is going on in this period, let me review different regions. Let me show them to you first. I'm going to talk about the North Highlands, basically this area in the North Coast, right? And I'm also going to talk about the South Central Coast, this area over here, and the South Central Highlands. Yes, because we don't have all the time of the world, I'm not going to talk about all other regions. I'm just going to focus on the most distant ones to give you a sense of what is going on during the early horizon and how unique it is, right? In the North Coast, for example, we find several ceremonial centers like Macanche, Chongoyape, Corbacho. You can see the names in the screen, but the subtitle software is working quite well. In the North Coast, we find local traditions of monumental architecture that actually date back to the late pre-ceramic and the initial period, these two periods I have talked about, right? And that preceded the early horizon. And like in all other regions during these two previous periods, we don't see much signs of such status inequality in the North Coast, but during the early horizon, we do. We see sociopolitical and economic transformations that are clearly marked by the emergence of status inequality, the emergence of the first elites, if you want. And the best evidence of the emergence of the first elites during this time are elaborate individual, quote unquote, individual burials with rich materials, prominently gold and precious stones that come from far away. Now, the more we look at these societies of the North Coast, right, the more clear is to us that they are quite independent, that they are quite autonomous of Chavin de Huántar. They interact with Chavin de Huántar, right? They actually influence Chavin de Wanter in art, in architecture. Chavin de Wanter actually adopted um, many artistic and architectural patterns from these North Coast societies. You can see that in the plazas that we found there, and in some of the emphasis in felines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But the most important point here is that these societies, let's say, go to Chavin de Wanter, visited Chavin de Wanter, made offerings in Chavin de Wanter, came back from Chavin de Wanter with new ideas, but they preserve their own local identities to a high degree. The picture to the right shows some objects that were looted in some elite tombs of this period in the north coast of Peru, right? Crowns. These are basically crowns, and it is a plaque made of gold that was cut to be sold. It's a part of the black market of antiquities that affects basically all areas where we see civilization and civilizations of antiquity around the world, right? In the northern highlands, we see similar pattern. Now here we have better evidence because the northern highlands have been um, the focus already for um, 3 decades of very large Japanese archaeological mission to Peru, right? Here we also find several ceremonial centers like Pacopampa and Kunturhuasi. This is Pacopampa and this is Kunturhuasi, right? Here we don't have step platforms or pyramids. We have rather horizontal architecture. Some of this architecture emulates things that we find in Chavin, but for the most part is actually quite local. It has clearly clear antecedents in local architecture from the initial period in the well, mainly the initial period in this area. Here we also see socio-political and economic transformation, and we see the emergence of the first elites. In the emergence of these elites, it's also clear in the existence of elaborate individual burials with rich materials. They were also connected with Chavin in a more of a peer polity interaction kind of pattern, right? And it also influenced Chavin in art and architecture. Let me show you some more pictures so you get an idea of this, right? These are some of the rich burials found at the site with ear spools and pendants made of gold. This is a woman, actually, high status lady, and that was buried in the center. Most of these rich burials, by the way, with um, rich materials like this, are located at the core of these ceremonial centers. So we speculate they are actually the burials of some sort of elite associated with religious functions at this site. And this one is Kunturhuasi, right, excavated by Japanese archaeologist Yoshio Onuki, right? It is also quite horizontal, if you want. It doesn't have these pyramids like Sabin de Wanter and other sites of the period, right? But right in the center of the site where they found several burials with crowns like this and pendants and pectorals like this. So this is quite interesting because most of the rich materials found in these burials are not any kind of materials. There are very specific kinds of goods or objects. They are pieces of personal adornment, right? Made with very new techniques, right? Difficult to master. And they actually, even more, they have complex iconography, religious iconography. So you get the idea, right? What you have is individuals basically showing off, highlighting themselves, right? Saying, hey, here I am, right? Dress with these notorious goods, right? I am dressed with these notorious goods adorned with mysterious secret iconography associated with a powerful center. And here I am to show you how different I am from you, right? Nothing like this we detect in the Andes before. During the initial period and during the late pre-ceramic, we do have ranked societies, but we do not have institutionalized inequality. There are some power differences. After all, you need leaders to organize large groups of people that can build these huge pyramids, right? But these leaders are never able to show off to everybody else how different they are from the rest of the population. They cannot presume their wealth. They actually do not have individual personal wealth that we know, right? But during the early horizon, at the very end of the early horizon, by the way, the situation is quite different. These leaders have become institutionalized. These leaders have finally managed to split themselves as a class from the rest of the population. And it didn't happen overnight. It actually took centuries to 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 emerge. They took centuries to emerge, to appear, right? For centuries, they actually kept in check, if you want. They were kept in check, right? They were never able to get their way and profit from their positions of leadership. But by the end of the early horizons, they finally did. Okay. In the south central coast, in the other extreme of the Chavin interaction sphere, we find a similar yet different pattern. In the south central coast, we do not have local traditions of ceremonial centers with monumental architecture. We only have villages. This is a less dense populated area with much simpler societies, if you want. And nonetheless, during the early horizon, we find in this area also the first signs of social, political, and economic transformations and the emergence of status inequality. Here, what we have are elaborate family burials. Some families, for some reason, are finally able to distinguish themselves from the rest in sites like Coyungo, Carwa, and Moyaque Chico, right? These areas are related to Chavin in a different way, not in a sort of peer polity interaction, in a pattern of interaction among equals, but they are actually in more of a center periphery interaction. They emulate Chavin de Wanter. They import a lot of Chavin de Wanter objects. They copy a lot of Chavin de Wanter objects. But they also, and this is worth to mention, they also copy other early horizon styles I have not talked about in this lecture, like the Kupisnike style from the North Coast, similar yet different from the Chavin de Wanter art style, or the Manchai style from the Central Coast, right? Similar yet quite different from the one in Chavin de Wanter, right? And also the Chavin de Wanter style. Now, by the way, Kupisnike style and Manchai style objects are found in Chavin de Wanter, and they are found in the offerings gallery I just described, right? these are some of the objects that were found in one of the looted tombs, family tombs in the south central coast of Peru. Remember this figure? I show you the reconstruction of this figure, right? It's a textile, this size, that is in a museum in the United States in Dumbarton Oaks, right? Famous research center in Washington, D.C. The whole textile is in there. It was looted from a tomb a long time ago. But a few years ago, one of my professors, Peter Kaulicke, his name is here, he excavated the looted tomb and he found a piece of the textile that actually matched a hole in the textile that is in the museum in Washington, D.C. He also found other objects in clear Chavin style. Quite a finding, quite an archaeological finding, by the way. This textile is the one I show you reconstructed, right? To convey to you the mysterious and intricate character of Chavin art, right? Okay. Now, finally, in the South Central Highlands, we see even a different pattern. Here we do have a local tradition of monumental architecture that dates back to the initial period. But ceremonial centers in this area during the early Horizon adopted typical Chavin architectural styles and methods of construction. Their centers began to have sunken circular plazas, right? They began to have galleries, very important, because galleries play an important role in oracle kind of rituals. Sites like Ataya and Campanayuj Rumi are the better investigated sites in this area. And here, once again, we also find the first signs in the area of socio-political and economic transformations, basically in terms of status inequality. But as in the case of the South Central coast, right, we see center-periphery interactions, not pure polity interactions. And there's a very good reason for this, right? Chadin people seem to have had a special interest in this area because some of the main sources of cinnabar, a mineral that is used in ritual, a red pigment that is used in rituals. It is made of mercury, if you want. And obsidian sources are located in this area. So it seems that Chavin de Wanter established very close relation with local elites, promoted these local elites, so to have a special access to these sources of materials. What we see, right, in this area is emulation of Chavin, but once again, we also see emulation of South Central Coast art styles, right? This is how, well, by the way, this is a typical vase found in the South Central Coast with post-fire pigments. This actually looks quite identical to some vessels I have excavated in the South Central Coast. By the way, that's the area where I have been working for the last 15 years. Okay, and this is how Campanayuj Rumi excavated my colleague and friend Yuichi Matsumoto actually looks like, right? It has a U-shaped pattern, but it's much smaller than Chadin, right? The masonry is very similar to the one that we find in Chavin. It has galleries and circular sunken circular plazas, right? Now, so what do we have during the early horizon, which is quite interesting? We have multiple overlapping interaction spheres. The picture to the right is actually a better depiction of this um, interaction, overlapping interaction sphere. Is a picture by my colleague and friend Michelle Young, a young professor at the Vanderbilt University right now, right? So we have multiple overlapping local, regional, and pan-regional interaction spheres that change over time. There is variation in the timing and nature of Chavin the Wanderer's influence on local populations through these complex networks, right? And this is a period with a clear expansion and intensification of long-distance networks that goes hand in hand with notable increases in foreign exotic goods, not just in Chavin the Wanderer, but in almost all ceremonial centers of this period, the few that survive, right? So what we see here is a set of complex processes of cultural contact, economic change, and very important identity transformation in the Andes, right? It's a cosmopolitan period, if you want. The early horizon is a time with a high degree of cultural cosmopolitanism. We have several ethnic and linguistic groups coming together, coming into direct or indirect contact with each other in different ways, right? These interactions were largely peaceful, and this is something very important to highlight. Very peaceful, perhaps thanks to shared religious beliefs that help structuring and facilitating cultural contact between distant and very different cultural groups. However, and there is no way I can emphasize this more, engagement with Chavin the Wanderer was quite diverse, and it was highly adapted to local conditions and preferences. This was by no means imposition of a religious cult, right? It was promotion of a religious cult. Some people adopted it, other people rejected it, right? Other people were just indifferent to it, right? So we are during the early horizon, we are still within this logic of ceremonial centers competing with each other, though in novel ways to attract people, to host people, to get adepts, right? To get friends, to get partners, um, and so on, right? Positive, quote unquote, positive competition, if you want. Now, this period, as all periods in prehistory, is going to come to an end, right? And so the Chavin interaction sphere eventually collapsed. And the collapse of the Chavin interaction sphere, and this is something really interesting, was largely um, synchronous. Um, it happened over 100 years all over the Andes. Chavin the Wanter itself and almost all other early horizon centers, the centers that remain from this long tradition of early ceremonial centers with monumental architecture in the Andes, were abandoned around this time. And with them, the cosmopolitanism was gone, right? This cosmopolitanism typical of the period between 1000 and 500 BCE, more or less, was replaced by a pattern of social political balkanization. A pattern that, as I mentioned, is what we usually have in the Andes. Now, new cultural groups, and this is a line of research that we are beginning to pursue, right? But we're beginning to accumulate evidence on this direction. New cultural groups especially from regions to the north and to the east of the Central Andes, seem to have moved into the region also around this time, right? Pottery, like the one that you see in the picture to the right, with what we call white on red or white on orange decoration, right, appears almost suddenly, I would say, around this time. Some of these people actually settled themselves on top of the ceremonial centers of the early horizon, right? On top of them. They pay no respect to these centers. These centers meant nothing to them, right? And with their arrival, right? But not just because of their arrival, we see in the following period, beginning at 500 BC, a clear increment in interpersonal violence, right? And we have several lines of evidence of this. Ceremonial centers are replaced by large nucleated settlements, very horizontal, without pyramids, right? And these large settlements are split in neighborhoods, right? And each neighborhood has its own small plaza for their own special, particular rituals. So they live in the same place, perhaps to defend themselves, right? But in spite of the fact that they are together, they worry a lot about performing their own rituals separated from the rest. So we live together, but we don't mix with each other that much. This is typical of situations in which you have um, population density reaching um, the carrying capacity of the environment, and resources become scarce, right? And people begin to compete for these resources, right? After 500 BC, we also say that people began to establish cemeteries, especially next to areas that have key resources for survival. They establish cemeteries there, right? They bury their dead there as to show everybody else this area is ours. And they also begin to build fortresses everywhere. So next to these settlements, there is always a fortress, usually located in a hilltop, where they can take refuge when they are attacked by other people. And when we excavate the cemeteries and we analyze the skeletons in these cemeteries, we have plenty of evidence of trauma, right? Of people being injured as a result of fighting with each other. This is what I call a quote unquote negative kind of competition. People are not longer competing to attract friends, to attract partners, to attract other people, right? And do things together. Now they are basically um, excluding other people, right? Not including them, but excluding them, right? Andean populations after 500 BC actually have moved from establishing or defining identity to defending identity. And that's what the rest of the history of the Andes is going to be about. It is going to be about writing and war and chieftains and early states competing with each other, right? We're going to see a host of local cultures, right? Very different from the previous one, appearing all across the Andes. And these are going to be local cultures that become more and more engaged in writing and war, right? What we have, in other words, is the beginning of a cycle of emergence, development, and collapse of more and more complex competing polities competing negatively, quote unquote, right? And this is going to characterize the rest of Andean pre-Hispanic history. Chieftains, early states, expanding states, empires are the main characters of this later story. But this is actually the subject of another lecture. Thank you so much. Hello.
For your lecture.
在场的
Yes,
同
if you-
学，在场的同学有没有想向杜兰托教授提问的？我们线上的老师同学有疑问的话，可以打在聊天框里。咱们现场的同学有要提问的吗？
我们首先非常感谢多兰多教授给我们做了一个精彩的讲座啊。我们对秘鲁考古呢都属于这个考古盲啊，不太了解实际情况。今天看了听了杜老师的讲座呢，我觉得至少从这个文化序列上已经比较清楚了。我看他分这个分期跟我跟大家介绍的差不多是吧？基本上是按照这个秘鲁这个考古和历史博物馆的年代序列来的，正好这个查文文化呢刚好处于这个很重要的这个公元前800年到公元前200年这个关键的时期。它主要是奠定了这个秘鲁文明或者是安第斯文明的这个基础，因为整个南美文明的核心区呢就是秘鲁和智利的北部地区。所以说这个查文文化呢在这里是起到了一个非常关键的作用。那我们鼓掌他也听不到，能听到吗？可以能听到是吧？那我们用掌声来感谢一下这个杜兰多教授。好，杜老师，我们可以结束了。他听到我说话了吗？杜教授实际上还一直在学中文。前段时间来这个咱们学校做。
Thank you, Professor. We may end up the meeting. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, you all, for your attention. It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. You have a good night.
Yeah,
Thanks
and
a lot.
wish you a good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, Professor.